Hey, Cornerstone, it is so good to be with you this weekend. Thanks so much for joining us. So I want to start by actually giving you a little quiz, and it's a quiz about something that we call idioms. Now, an idiom is a form of a speech that every language has that actually doesn't make sense if you took it literal. So we use them all the time. The French people have idioms, the Spanish people have idioms. In English, we have idioms. Play it by ear. It's an idiom. It doesn't make sense if you thought of it literally, like play it by ear. How do you think of playing the piano by ear, or it's raining cats and dogs? Think about that literally. Or their head is in the clouds. I mean, how tall do you have to be? So here's my quiz. We're gonna actually put a picture on the screen. An artist drew out what an idiom, this particular idiom, may look like if it was taken literally. And I wanna give you just a few seconds, and I want you to shout out at home, if you're on the couch, if you're in the kitchen watching on the table, then just shout out what the idiom is that you're seeing. So for example, let's go ahead and put that first one up there. Okay, what would that idiom be? Killing time. All right, so you kind of have the idea. All right, here's the next one. We'll see if you can get any better at this. What is that? Literally, that would be what? Breaking your word. All right, some of you are struggling. Watch this next one, okay? What is this one? Think about it. Some of you shouted it out. You got it right away. Some of you are still struggling. Hungry eyes. How about this next one? You get it? Eye candy. All right, we only got a few more. Some of you have not gotten a single one right yet. Okay, here's the next one. You get it? Some of you are struggling. Cool as a cucumber. All right, two more. The last one's my favorite. Two more. Okay, put up the next one. Go ahead. Think about it. And we got two more chances. Let your mind wander. And here's my favorite one, the last one. Go ahead and put it up. From the bottom of your heart. From the bottom of your heart. Okay, so these are idioms. Every language has them. The English has a bunch of idioms, but here's an idiom that I think maybe you and I should take literally. Most of the time, idioms make no sense if taken literally, but here's one that maybe you and I should take literally. I'm losing my mind. I'm losing my mind. You see, here's how we usually use it in the English language. Oh, if I hear that song one more time, I'm going to lose my mind. Oh, if this preacher doesn't stop talking, I'm going to lose my mind. But I would suggest to you that perhaps this is one that we should take literally. I'm losing my mind. Why would I say that? Let me show you. If you have your Bibles, open to 1 Corinthians chapter 2. If you have a hard copy Bible, it's about 2/3 of the way through the Bible. You get to the New Testament, start turning to your right, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians. Go to the table of contents if you need to and find the page number. If you have a smart device and you have a Bible app, find 1 Corinthians. I really want you to see this. I want you to be looking at these passages, these verses as we unpack this. Why would I say that it's maybe a good idea for you and I to take this idiom, I'm losing my mind, literally? You see, we're in this series called Bold Claims, and there's something that Paul is going to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 that is this bold claim, but when we connect it to this idea of losing our mind, oh, it makes sense. God, help us get this. God, I beg you, I plead with you. In fact, as we're gonna see, you tell us right in this chapter we're gonna look at that we cannot understand this. We cannot grasp the enormity of this truth without your help. So Spirit of God, I pray that you would open our hearts and minds to understand this, God. So 1 Corinthians chapter 2, I want you to drop all the way to the end of the chapter. We're in verse 16, and not just drop to the end of the chapter, I want you to drop to the last sentence of the last verse in chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, last sentence in the last verse of 1 Corinthians chapter 2. 1 Corinthians 2:16, it says this, but we have the mind of Christ. Now the we in there, he's talking to Jesus followers. He's talking to those people who've put their faith and trust in Jesus. He's saying, if you put your faith and trust in Jesus, we have the mind of Christ. Now, let me back up a little bit and read the whole verse to you because there's some tension. If you read the whole verse, it should leave you scratching your head and going, wait, it seems like Paul is contradicting himself because he's going to quote Isaiah in the first part of verse 16. He quotes Isaiah, something that the prophet Isaiah said 700 years before, and then he follows it up with this phrase, but we have the mind of Christ. Look with me, 1 Corinthians 2:16. Now look at the whole verse. Isaiah wrote this, "Who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him?" It was a hypothetical question that Isaiah gave 700 years before Paul wrote this. He's saying, who can know or who can instruct God? Who can know the mind of God? Hypothetical question. The answer is, well, no one. And yet, Paul finishes the verse by saying, who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. What? Oh, my friend, if you've been a believer very long, if you've been a follower of Jesus very long, you've probably heard that. And I hope somehow God can open our hearts and minds to understand how magnificent this is. The enormity of that statement. If you're a new follower of Jesus, you maybe have never heard that. And you should be sitting there going, I have the mind of Christ? If you're watching and you've never put your faith and trust in Jesus, you should be sitting there going, I want that. I want the mind of Christ. Let me show you what I mean. You see, you got to understand the context of this chapter. And for the sake of time, we're not going to look at all the verses, but let me go back and just explain the context. If you were to read 1 Corinthians chapter 2, you would see that Paul begins by saying, hey, Corinthians. He's talking to the Jesus followers in Corinth. He's saying, hey, Corinthians, when I came to you with a really simple message. And the simple message really involved two things. I came to you and told you who is Jesus and what Jesus did. So Paul is saying, when I came to you the first time, my message was that Jesus is the Son of God and that Jesus died for your sins and he rose from the dead, proving that he had power over sin and death. And then Paul says this. In 1 Corinthians 2, Paul says, but there's more to this message than just that simple message. And he's actually going to use this word. He's going to say, there's mystery. And I whisper that word because mystery, when you whisper it, it sounds a little more mysterious. So Paul is saying, when I came to you with a very simple message, but I want you to know there's mystery to this message. In fact, read 1 Corinthians 2 later, Paul is going to say this mystery that I want to tell you about actually goes back to before time began. What? Paul is saying before the sun existed, before there were stars, before there was the moon, before any animals were created, before there were any humans, before any molecule was created, there was this mystery. And then Paul, and now I'm going to quote Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul is saying this mystery that existed before time began is so immense that, now I'm quoting him, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind can imagine. So you got to get that context now. Paul is saying there's this mystery that existed before time that no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind can imagine. We pick it up now. Look at verse 12 of chapter 2. Watch what he does now. Oh, that we would get this. Paul says, he's talking again to believers, people who have put their faith and trust in Jesus, what we have received is not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, so that, remember he's been talking about this mystery, so that we may understand what God has freely given us. Listen, if you didn't just sit up in your couch a little bit, if you didn't just lean forward, if you didn't maybe just exhale a little bit, if you didn't maybe look at whoever you're watching this with and go, what? You're missing the enormity of what he just said. Remember, Paul just got done saying there's this mystery that existed before anything in this world existed. And this mystery is so immense that no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind can imagine. And then he says, but you get it. Let me read that again. Look at verse 12 again. what we have received is not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, so that we may understand what God has freely given us, so that we may understand this mystery. You see, who existed before time existed? Who existed before anything was here? Who existed before the sun and the moon and the stars and animals and human beings? Who existed before any molecule? Spirit of God. Who is it that can understand what no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind can imagine? The Spirit of God. And so he's saying, if you put your faith and trust in Jesus, Romans 8:9 teaches this. If you put your faith and trust in Jesus, you have the Spirit. So now through the Spirit, you can understand this mystery. Look what he says next. Continue with his logic. Look down at verse 14. The person with the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them, the person without, I read that wrong, you gotta read it right. The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness and cannot understand them. Why? Because they are discerned only through the Spirit. Paul is saying there's this mystery that no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind can imagine. And so Paul is saying, well, no wonder if someone doesn't have the Spirit of God, why they can't understand it, why it doesn't make sense to them. In fact, look at the next verse. Look at verse 15. The person with the Spirit of God, makes judgments about all things, but such a person is not subject to merely human judgments. Okay, here's simply what he's saying by that. He's saying there are going to be some unspiritual critics. You get it? You've probably experienced it before. There's going to be a bunch of people that look at what you claim to believe in, and they're going to scratch their head and going, are you kidding me? You're a fool. Why would you believe that? What, are you serious? You know what you really have? It's a religious crutch. That's what you have. And Paul is saying, you're going to have those. They're not going to understand the depth of this because they don't have the Spirit of God. Now, look at the last verse again. Talk about a bold claim. Look at this verse again. Go down to verse 16 again. After he explains all of that in chapter 2, he quotes Isaiah from 700 years before, and he says, who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? And then he says this, but we have the mind of Christ. What? You see, notice he's not saying we should have the mind of Christ, or maybe we will get the mind of Christ. He's saying we have the mind of Christ. Now, why is that so important? Because we're in a battle. You see, you and I are in a battle, and we have an enemy who hates us, and we have an enemy that is hell-bent on destroying us. We have an enemy that will do everything that he can, and it's not so much that he hates us, he hates our dad, he hates our father. And a long time ago, our enemy realized he can't defeat the father, he can't defeat dad, so he'll go after the children. It's the same thing the mobs have understood. It's the same thing that street gangs have understood. It's the same things that depraved, evil humans have figured out. If you can't hurt dad, hurt his children. And we have an enemy that hates our dad, so he hates us. And he knows he can't get to the father, so he's gonna go after us. And you know where the main battleground is? This battle between the enemy is us and us? It's right here. It's right here. And this is why Paul, in a sense, was reminding the Corinthians 2,000 years ago, and for you and I today, he's saying, do you understand that you have the mind of Christ? Or here's how I'm gonna put it. He's trying to get them to understand, you need to let the mind of the master be the master of your minds. You need to let the mind of the master be the master of your minds. You have the mind of Christ. You have to let the mind of the master be the master of your minds. You see, that's why I say that maybe we should take this idiom literally. I'm losing my mind. Good. That's what we need to do. We need to lose our mind and take the mind of the master. And it's not in Corinthians, when Paul is writing this, the only place in the Bible where we see this. It's all over the Bible. And so let me just read a couple of verses. You might want to write these down because you're not going to have time to look them up. I'm going to go rather quickly. But in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23, 3,000 years ago, the wisest man on earth wrote these words. He said, above all else, guard your heart. It was written in Hebrew, and Hebrew, the word heart, can also be translated mind or thoughts. Above all else, guard your heart, guard your mind, guard your thoughts. For everything you do flows from it. Let the mind of the master be the master of your mind. Okay, look at Colossians chapter 3, verse 2. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. Let the mind of the master be the master of your mind. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we, underline these next words, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Let the mind of the master be the master of your mind. Romans 12:2, and we're gonna talk about this one for a moment, but in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, Paul wrote, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed. How? By the renewing of your mind. Why does transformation come from the renewing of our mind? Because we have an enemy that hates us, and he's hell-bent on destroying us, and his main battleground is right here. Why is it that Paul said transformation, if your life is going to be transformed, renewed, why is it that it's from the renewing of the mind? Because beliefs determine behavior. Your beliefs will eventually become your actions, which will become your habits, which will become your destiny. Your beliefs will eventually become your actions, which will become your habits, which will become your destiny, which is why Paul says transformation comes from renewing the mind. Why is it that he says transformation comes from renewing the mind? Because ideas have consequences. And there's a negative side to that and a positive side to that. So let me start with the negative side of that. Ideas have consequences. Let me illustrate with this. Racism. Racism. You know where that comes from? An idea that is contrary to the biblical narrative. You see, there are not multiple races. There's only one race, the human race. And the Bible teaches that very clearly. That at the end of God's creation, he creates the pinnacle of his creation. The only thing in all of his creation he creates in his image is humans. And there's only one race, the human race. Now, within the human race, he created a lot of diversity and different ethnicities, different colors of people. But it's one human race. And when human beings began to teach that there were multiple races within the human race, well, you've read enough history to know what happened in this country and what's happened throughout human history. Ideas have consequences. In the mid-19th century, a guy by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche actually penned some ideas that a couple of decades later, guys like Marx and Lenin and Adolf Hitler adopted and put into action. And within about 60 years, 150 million people were killed because of some ideas. Ideas have consequences. In the mid-1980s, Ted Yamamori, he was then the president of Food for the Hungry, and he was actually in Ethiopia. And there was a huge tent city where they had a bunch of people that were coming in, and they were feeding them during that famine. And one day, Ted Yamamori is walking by a tent, and he hears a little baby crying, and he stops, and he looks inside the tent, and he sees this baby there all alone, and he goes and he scoops up the baby, and he holds in his arm, and he starts looking around and asking questions, and finally he finds the mother, and he holds the baby out to the mother, and the mother says, no, that baby was destined to die. And Ted Yamamori goes, no, this baby is destined to live. Two different ideas with two very different outcomes. Ideas have consequences. Young people, if you would get this, parents, if you're young, if you have a elementary kid or junior high or high school and they're sitting next to you right now, knock the phone out of their hands and say, just pay attention. If you miss everything else that he said, you got to get this part. Young people, ideas have consequences. We have an enemy that is hell-bent on destroying us, and the main battleground is right here. And you know one of the ideas that he's going to put in your mind, and I know that because he's put in every other human being, is he's going to get you to question the goodness of God. So what he did with Eve in the very beginning of the story. I can promise you, if he hasn't done this yet, he's going to do this. And he's gonna get you to start thinking, oh, man, this God is just a killjoy. He's like some overbearing boss, just handing down a bunch of rules, just trying to make life miserable. And he's gonna get you to question the goodness of God. And when you begin to question the goodness of God, when you begin to buy into that, it's going to eventually become actions, which will become habits, which will become your destiny. Ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences. You know what's interesting is that scientists will actually say that there's something between 50,000 and 60,000 thoughts that will go through our mind every day. That's like 35 to 45 every single minute. We have an enemy who is hell-bent on destroying us, and his main battleground is right here. 35 to 45 thoughts every minute. Ideas have consequences. Beliefs determine behavior. It's why Paul is saying, let the mind of the master be the master of your mind. You get that you and I, our brains it's magnificent how God created us, but there's all kinds of things that happen every day with our brains, but we don't even actually consciously think about it, right? My heart is beating. From the time I was in my mother's womb until I die, my heart will beat. And I don't sit around going, beat heart. I'm not thinking, it just does it. I blink. I'm blinking, bringing moisture to my eyes, happening all the time. I'm not consciously thinking, blink your eyes, blink your eyes, blink your eyes. When you walk, once you learn to walk as a child, we don't anymore go left foot, right foot, left. So there's all kinds of things that our brain is doing and we're not even thinking about it, including beliefs. See, you and I have some beliefs that we picked up because of the home we grew up in, or because of the TV shows we watched growing up, or because of the movies we watched, or the books we read, or the culture we grow up in. And there's some belief systems we have that we don't even think about, that we're filtering things through, and they're hurting us because they're not true. Ideas have consequences. In fact, this is gonna take courage on your part. This is my challenge for you and I, and this is gonna take a tremendous amount of courage. It's what I call an internal vow. I think every human being has at least one, probably multiple internal vows. And when you were a young person, maybe 5, maybe 7, maybe 8, maybe 12, you took on an internal vow, and it was a way to survive. Whatever it was, you were at recess, someone was making fun of you, you grew up in an abusive home. Let me give you some examples of internal vows. Internal vows, by the way, they work until they stop working. They were a survival mechanism that maybe you needed, but now they're hurting you, or they will eventually hurt you. So an internal vow that some of you maybe made was when you were young, you grew up in an abusive home, and so you put up a wall and you said, I'm not ever gonna let anybody hurt me again. And you don't do relationships well anymore. You needed that to survive. You took you didn't even realize you took that internal vow. But somewhere in your past, you took on something that is now hurting you. You don't do relationships because you said, I'll never let anybody hurt me again. And you cannot have a healthy relationship without being honest and transparent and open. It's an internal vow, a lie that you don't even realize that you're believing. Let me just share my internal vow. I didn't realize this until I was in my early 40s, and this actually worked. In fact, this internal vow made me very successful for most of my life. It worked until it didn't work. See, my internal vow, I didn't get this until I was in my early 40s, was I'll prove you wrong. Almost everything I've done in my life, I've done based on someone said I couldn't do it, and I said, I'll prove you wrong. I married my wife, and when I went to her and asked her to marry me, I found out later that my mentor, a man that I greatly respected, actually went to my wife and said, don't marry him, because I was from the wrong side of the tracks, because I came from a broken family. And when I heard that, I thought, I'll prove you wrong. And I got every book I could find about what it meant to be a good husband. And I got mentors in my life. And so it worked. Almost every job I've had, I didn't have enough education. I've never done this before. And people said, well, you can't do it. And I said, I'll prove you wrong. And I was pretty successful with that until I wasn't, because it's an exhausting way to live. It's an exhausting way to live. And when I was in my early 40s, I crashed. And part of my crash was I recognized that I wasn't just resting in what God says about me. I don't need to prove myself. God says, you're my son. I love you no matter what. And so here's what I'm challenging you with. Our Our brains are doing things all the time and we don't even realize it, including believing something that's a lie, an internal vow. And I want you in the next hours, in the next days, in the next weeks, I want you to start wrestling with God on what that internal vow is. Write it down, pray about it, take it to God. But let God uncover some internal vow that you took a long time ago that's hurting you. Ideas have consequences. Beliefs determine behavior. That's why Paul is saying, let the mind of the master be the master of your mind. See, that's the negative side of ideas have consequences. Here's the positive side. A mind change will eventually become a heart change, which will eventually become a life change. Do you get that? Remember, we have an enemy, and his main battleground is right here. And the positive side that ideas have consequences is why Paul is saying, you have the mind of Christ. Let the mind of the master be the master of your mind. Because the positive side of this is when we change our mind, when the Spirit of God changes our mind, it will eventually change our hearts, which will change our life. Transformation comes from the renewal of the mind, Romans 12:2. Some of you may remember or may have seen that movie, The Hobbit. They actually had a couple of them. And in one of those, there's this scene that is such a powerful scene. And there's this dragon in the background. And he's breathing fire. And his wings are destroying the city. And people are dying and screaming and yelling. And there's this father that gets this massive crossbow. And he puts it on his son's shoulder. Because he's got to hit this dragon in the perfect spot. And he puts it on the shoulder of his son, and his son is standing, and his back is to the dragon, and he can hear all this commotion. He can hear the fire and the screaming and the yelling and the destruction. And so he does this. He starts to look back, and the father, oh, it's such a powerful scene. The father says, look at me. Look at me. Focus on me. And I think that's Jesus' message for you and me. You, if you put your faith and trust in Jesus, you have the mind of Christ. Focus on me. Focus on me. Look at me. Let me show you these beliefs that you've bought into that are hurting you, these internal vows that you took on that are hurting you. Look at me. Focus. Let the mind of the master be the master of your mind. Oh God, that we would get that. Talk about a bold claim that we have your mind, that you gave us your mind, that the Spirit, your Spirit lives in us. We don't have to buy into these lies anymore. We don't have to believe these lies anymore. We don't have to live out these lies anymore. That you're saying, I want to set you free. Oh God, may we, in the next hours, in the next days, in the next weeks, may we have the courage to allow your Spirit to open our eyes and understand some of these internal vows, these beliefs that we've been living that are hurting us. We love you, Jesus. Amen.